Hello folks, my name's Paul and I am one of the lecturers in Applied Animal Science and Zoo Biology at University Centre Sparsholt, and I would like to talk to you a bit about some of your animal management units that you'll do on the degree as part of your course at Sparsholt. And I'd like to do this virtually by using some of my own animals to give you a taste of the types of things that you might experience as an undergraduate at University Centre Sparsholt. So this afternoon I'm going to introduce you to some of my birds, what we are currently doing with them in terms of husbandry and management, and how this can inform some of your learning when you finally get to see the animals that we have at Sparsholt College. So behind me you can see my little family of North American wood ducks, or Carolina ducks as they're also called, and these ducklings hatched out in April, so they're round about a month old. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about their management and a bit about how we keep them healthy and why we do breeding interventions with these types of birds from a zoo and a conservation perspective. So you just need to stretch your minds a bit and imagine that you are at the zoo, not in my back garden, and that this is a really rare and endangered species, and consequently what we do with its husbandry is really, really important for captive breeding and conservation breeding programs of globally threatened species. And actually you probably don't have to stretch your imaginations that much, because the North American wood duck once upon a time was a threatened species at very, very real risk of extinction. And it was techniques that I'm going to show you today that actually helped bring it back from the brink of extinction, and it now has a sustainable population. So I'm going to give the birds a treat and hopefully they'll come a bit closer to me, because at the moment they're a bit not quite that keen on the camera. And I'll talk to you a bit more about the birds that I've got and what we're doing with them. So one of their favourite treats are mealworms, and they sell their soul for mealworms and they sell their soul for lettuce as well. So hopefully you might get a better view of them. So I've got 5 ducklings in this enclosure with their mum, who is the camouflaged bird, and also with their dad, who's the brightly coloured bird as well, who might come on camera. Dad plays no part in parental care, but he's very, very much in love with his wife. So we like to keep them together because they simply love each other very much. So I'm just going to throw them some different types of greens. So I've got a range of different greens that I use for the birds, and I also collect things like dandelions as well, because they really, really enjoy those. But it's really important to remember that if you ever have ducklings, that you provide them with greenery with a really good calcium to phosphorus ratio, i.e. don't give them any green food such as spinach, which is likely to strip calcium out of growing bones. Ducklings take quite a lot of looking after. Although they can fend for themselves from hatching, when we hatch them out in captivity, they're incredibly messy and can be incredibly mucky. So they take a lot of water changes, a lot of cleaning, and a lot of fresh food and water to make sure it doesn't soil or get spoilt in the sun. So we clean these birds out relatively frequently to make sure they stay nice and clean and dry. Ducklings are not necessarily waterproof from when they hatch. They get their waterproofing from their mother. So if they get damp, they can get cold very quickly. So it's really, really important that we keep them clean and dry, give them lots of bedding, lots of fresh water to bathe in, and lots of opportunities to dabble around like they would do normally if they were out in the wild, because that provides them with the same opportunities to grow and develop as they would as wild birds. So I'm sure you can see that dad is really, really brightly coloured and mum is cryptic, and that's called sexual dimorphism, where one animal looks totally different to another animal. He is evolved to look really conspicuous to show off to the females, but also when she's sitting on eggs and is camouflaged on the nest, it's dad's job to look really conspicuous and draw predators away from the nest. So he might not have a direct role in parental care, but his really colourful presence is really important to the long-term survival of the youngsters. Now the wood duck, hence its name, is a North American species. As I said, it's also known as a Carolina wood duck, and it comes from those states in the US. And at the turn of the last century, it was doing really badly. And it's thanks to schemes that involve putting up nest boxes and wild world conservation driven by bird-loving individuals that has actually saved the wood duck from extinction. So whilst it's now an incredibly common bird in zoological collections and also in private collections as well, at one point it was driven nearly to the edge of extinction. And some of the techniques that we use for hatching and rearing these birds have now been transferred to other types of really threatened species, so that we can use the same skills which we have learned with birds like this to other animals that now really need our help. They've all vanished from camera. I think they've kind of stopped. Oh no, they're back. And they might have stopped wanting to be stars of the day for some mealworms. So ducklings grow very quickly, and that depends on the type of bird we're talking about and the type of natural environment that they come from. So generally speaking, ducklings from the northern hemisphere grow much quicker than ducklings from the southern hemisphere. And that's because northern hemisphere ducklings have to grow quickly before winter arrives. In temperate climates, spring and summer are short. And consequently, they've got to grow their new feathers and fledge the nest and fly off, look after themselves before the cold weather arrives. So these birds, whilst they're only a month old, are not too far away from being the size of their parents. And that's a normal growth rate in these birds. If this was a southern hemisphere species, we would expect a much slower growth rate because they don't have to worry so much about these temperate climates. If they're a tropical bird, they can afford to grow at a much slower rate. So we see different growth rates and we weigh the birds to make sure they're growing properly, which is very much dependent on species. So I'm just going to give them a few more mealworms so they might come a bit closer, and then I'm going to talk to you a bit more about their biology and ecology and how that influences animal management. Wood ducks are not a dabbling duck and they're not a diving duck. They used to be called a perching duck, although that's not technically a taxonomic term, it just describes the behaviours that they do. So they're a very generalist species that can exist in a range of habitats. And that means in captivity, they're relatively easy to cater for because they don't have very many specialist requirements. So I'm just going to show you the types of foods that we use for the adults and for the ducklings, so you can see what we do on a daily basis to keep these birds healthy. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you just briefly about the diet of the birds so you can see what they get fed in their different life stages. So the adults get a mix of wheat, which is a really high protein grain and really good for growing feathers and all of the energy requirements for going in and out of the breeding season. And within that mix of wheats, they also get a bespoke waterfowl pellet as well. So this is like a high concentrate ration. You can't really see it very well, it's not very exciting, but it's like a standard pelleted food that you would use for most types of animals in captivity that gives them all of the needs, their energy needs, nutritional needs that they would have on a daily basis for meeting their energy requirements. The youngsters are a little bit different. So they get a mix of the fine grain that you can see in here, which is a chick crumb. So that's kind of like a milled pellet. And then we're just weaning them onto the adult diet as well. So they're getting this mixture of the really high energy, high protein chick crumb mixed in with the adult diet as a weaning aid to get them off their baby food and onto their adult food. And that's really important when you are looking after young animals, but particularly young birds, because they can develop something called angel wing, which is where the primary feathers, so the long feathers on the end of the wing, grow too quickly because you've given them too much protein, and then the wings end up bending outwards, and that's irreversible if left untreated. So if you hatch and rear ducklings, goslings, cygnets, chicks, baby turkeys, baby pheasants, anything like that, which is feeding on these chick crumbs, you need to make sure that they're not eating too much, that they're not growing too quickly, because that can have health impacts later in life. And what causes the bending of the wings, this angel wing shape, is basically the feather is growing too quickly for the skeleton, and the feather becomes too heavy as it grows really fast, so it bends the skeleton outwards, and consequently the wing bones don't form normally. So that's why when I said earlier that we weigh our ducklings and we make sure we know how quickly they're growing, that we also measure their diet and their intake, and we give them the right type of food for their right life stage, and that prevents those types of problems. As well as the wood ducks, I also have a pair of their close relatives, the Mandarin Duck. And the Mandarin comes from China and other parts of Asia. This is Mr. Mandarin. He wears this brilliantly coloured uniform, and he's got these bright orange sail feathers on his back. He's starting to look a little bit scruffy at the moment because he's going into molt at the end of the breeding season. And like many birds, when they are out of the courtship season, what they do is change their plumage so they look more camouflage and more cryptic. So what you'll end up seeing by the end of the spring into the summer is Mr. Mandarin will look very much like his girlfriend, who is a camouflage grey-brown colour, and that keeps him cryptic whilst he's growing a brand new set of feathers. And I actually have one of his loose orange sail feathers that I can show you. So this is Mr. Mandarin's sail feather that he molted the other day. You can see it's a really strange shape, and it's evolved to show off his quality as a potential mate to the females. It's got a blue edge which reflects the light, which you probably can't see very well, and it's got a white tip as well as being orange. And he grows a new pair of these every year, so that's a lot of energy and a lot of investment in something that's purely for the purposes of attracting a mate. And that's what we call the Handicap Principle, which basically means it's a sexually selected trait that involves a lot of energy on the part of the animal producing that trait, which is just for reproduction. It doesn't convey him any benefits to survival or longevity. It's simply something that he grows to make himself a much better partner. So we've got different nest boxes that we use for the birds, and these nest boxes are designed around their natural ecology. So these are species that are called perching ducks or tree ducks, so they nest in hollows in trees, and therefore we have to give them the same type of thing when we want to breed them in captivity. So what I'm going to try and do now is show you my female Mandarin, who is still sitting on a nest. She has a clutch of 6 eggs, so I'll show you her nest. She might come off the nest quite quickly when I do this, but don't worry about that. And then I'm going to take the eggs and candle them and try and show you what it looks like inside, so you can see the developing duckling. And that's what we do to work out when the eggs are likely to hatch, and therefore prepare the rearing area so that the ducklings and their mother can be healthy and grow normally. So my Mandarin is in that nest box, and as you can see, she came out quite quickly. So let me show you what it looks like inside. She hasn't got that long left before incubation finishes. So what you can see are her eggs with a thick covering of down, and she uses that to protect the eggs, to make sure that they're nice and cozy and they keep their heat. So I'm going to take the eggs out now and put them in a bowl, keep them warm, and then I'm going to take them inside and candle them. So I'm just going to switch the camera off whilst I do this, and I'll start recording again when I can show you what the eggs look like inside. Okay, so I hope you can see that I've got my nest of eggs and I've got the covering of down that I've taken out of the nest itself. So what I'm going to do, if this will work, because I've got to be in the dark to show you the developing embryo, I'll take one of the eggs out of the basket, the bowl rather. So they're quite heavy, but can you see there's a large air space at the end of that, and there is a dark mass. I don't quite know how well that's coming out on my camera, but I hope you can see that there is a large dark area on the egg, which is the developing duckling, and at the top of the egg is the airspace that the chick will hatch into, will pip through the inner membrane and then out externally from the egg. So that's an example of a fertile egg which is not too far off hatching. Let's have a look at another one. Again, the eggs are all very heavy because of the developing duckling in them. So we always do this from the blunt end of the egg. And I hope again you can see on this one that we've got a dark area and we've got a paler area, which is the airspace. So again, that is a symbol of a fertile egg. So I've just candled all of these eggs and they're all fertile. So each one of them contains a baby duckling. So we can work out when the egg is due to hatch based on the size of the airspace. The airspace gets bigger as the chick starts to develop up to hatching. So that's a surefire way that your eggs are getting ready to hatch. So I'm going to put these back there in the nest box so they don't get cold, so Mum will go back and sit on them. Here's Mrs. Mandarin, back sitting tightly on her eggs, none the wiser for what's just happened. Ducks don't make their own nests. So for tree nesting species, like the wood duck and the mandarin, we provide them with a deep layer of potting compost in their nest box, which keeps the humidity up, and on top of that we put a layer of wood shavings, which is good insulation. She will then make a depression in the middle of the wood shavings and she will lay her eggs into it. When she's ready to start incubation, she will line the nest with her own down to keep the eggs extra warm. Ducks start incubation when the last egg is laid, and that's how you know incubation is about to start, when you see the layer of down, and she'll sit on these eggs for 30 days. I mentioned earlier that the North American wood duck was very nearly driven to extinction at the start of the 20th century. And I thought I'd illustrate the success of this conservation program to you and how it links to some of the husbandry techniques that you've seen so far. So this is a piece of interpretation at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust at Slimbridge, which is where I do some of my research. And I asked one of my colleagues there to take this photo because obviously nobody can get there to see the birds at the moment, and send it to me. It illustrates quite beautifully how a simple husbandry technique, such as the design, construction and implementation of nest boxes, can be really useful to increasing breeding of captive birds and wild birds. And it was the erection and the maintenance and then the checking of nest boxes that has been so important to the wood duck's success out in the wild. Because this is a bird that doesn't breed on the ground, if there is a loss of habitat and a loss of suitable nesting sites, that's incredibly detrimental to any population recovery. So the avid conservationists back at the turn of the last century that realised the wood duck was in trouble created a very simple strategy for saving this species that has been incredibly successful, and now the wood duck is listed as least concern by the IUCN. And these techniques of simple management that is biologically relevant and based on the ecology of the animal, and all of those skills that keepers have, can be implemented in conservation projects of current threatened species that still need our help. Husbandry in the zoo really does inform wild world conservation. Let's look at the behavioural ecology of these two birds in a little bit more detail. I won't judge you if you look at this picture and you think you're looking at exactly the same animal. The female mandarin and the female wood duck look incredibly similar. But here's a little trick that will help you tell them apart. It's to do with the white makeup around their eye. The female wood duck is on the left. She gets very messy with her makeup, and her eyeliner goes all the way around her eye and all the way down her stripe. Her eye sits within her makeup. Whereas the female mandarin, she's much more refined, and she does a very classy stripe under her eye. So the female mandarin's eye sits on her makeup. I hope you can see that from the photo. So just to repeat, the female wood duck is the one on the left, and the female mandarin is the one on the right. There are other differences that we can use ecologically to separate these birds, and I'll come on to that shortly. Whilst the wood duck and the mandarin occur in the same ecological niche in their respective range states, they both live in wooded wetlands, they both like to perch in trees, they both nest off the ground in tree cavities, and they both have a very generalised feeding and foraging strategy. There are differences in their behavioural ecology that means their ranges don't overlap, and consequently, as an introduced or feral bird, one of them does much better in foreign parts of the world than the other. So what I'd like to show you now is the distribution, the range maps of these two species, and explain why they don't overlap in where you find them. So here we have the range of the wood duck on the left across North America. Its wintering grounds in blue, where you find it all year round in green, and where it nests only in light green. And on the right we have the range of the mandarin. Blue, yellow and dark green populations in Asia, and then across into Europe and the United Kingdom we see populations there illustrated in light green. This difference in geographic location of these populations comes back to the breeding strategy of these two birds. Now in this video I have introduced you to a brood of wood ducks and a mandarin who's sitting on her eggs. They're both at different stages of their yearly reproductive cycle, and that has really important implications for where these birds can live. The wood duck is confined to North America because it breeds early in the year, and it breeds when there's only particular food resources around. The mandarin, however, breeding later in the year, has ducklings when there are a wider range of food resources around. So consequently, mandarins outside of their range states are more adaptable to the different types of resources that they can access when they have ducklings. Whereas the wood duck, breeding earlier in the year, if it finds itself in a different location, in a different type of woodland, it might not necessarily have the food resources available that can support its youngsters. Consequently, the later breeding of the mandarin has allowed it to be successful in parts of the world where it's not native, but this has confined the wood duck to North America. And this is illustrated by these photos that I took rather strangely now in our very last normal weekend, dare I say, before we went into lockdown. This is Richmond Park in London, and here you can see a wooded wetland with a pond with several pairs of mandarins swimming on it. The mandarin in the United Kingdom is incredibly successful and has a relatively large population. In fact, some people believe there are now more mandarins living here in the UK than there are in their native China. No other breeding duck in the United Kingdom nests in trees to the same extent as the mandarin does. So these original introduced birds were able to exploit a niche that no other species of waterfowl was using, and consequently that's been to their advantage. We don't actually know what the effect of these feral mandarins is on our native wildlife. Some people believe they're completely benign. They have no effect whatsoever on other breeding birds. Other people believe they might be competing with other hole nesting species and potentially driving out birds that are native from suitable nesting sites. However, what does seem to be the case at the moment at least is that the mandarin is very restricted to wooded areas where wetlands are common. So around Sparsholt College, for example, in the New Forest and in parts of Hampshire where we do have wooded wetlands, mandarins are common. Likewise towards London, at a place called Virginia Water, which is near Windsor, as well as in Richmond Park and Bushy Park, some of the royal parks in London, mandarins are common because of the ancient woodland with trees full of nesting cavities that they can exploit. And here is another photograph of a female mandarin with very young ducklings that was taken in Richmond Park. This species has become very successful, as I said. And I like to think personally that it adds a splash of a colour, a very exotic looking animal that lives alongside our native mallards, coots, moorhens and mute swans. And I hope it's not doing any harm to our native biodiversity. But we must remember when we keep such birds in captivity that we don't allow them to escape, that we make sure we keep them secure so we don't see an influx of such non-native and potentially feral species into our native biodiversity. What I would like to show you now is a short video that I have taken from the BBC Springwatch Facebook page. I'm allowed to do this for educational reasons. Panic not. So here we can see a camera trap and a nest box camera that has been used to record one of the mandarins and one of the wood ducks' strangest behaviours. Here is a brood of mandarins fledgling from their nesting cavity, several metres up in a tree. And these ducklings will naturally fling themselves back down to the ground. In fact, if you rear both mandarin and wood duck ducklings in captivity, when they hatch, between 24 and 48 hours after hatching, they're incredibly wriggly, incredibly active. And that's because they're looking for the nest hole entrance to jump out of. They are hatched, programmed to throw themselves out of their nest to the safety of the ground so they can follow their mother to feeding sites. Okay, so back to my brood of wood ducks and my cinematography, which is probably better than the BBC's, let's face it. I'd like to end by showing you some ideas for enrichment that we can use for our captive birds to keep them happy and healthy, to keep them occupied, and to increase their behavioural diversity. For my ducks that have access to a pond, that have access to some deep bowls for diving and bathing in, I use these long, shallow seed trays as enrichment trays. I simply fill them with water, and then I collect greens, which I showed you earlier, or I scatter feed them with mealworms. And it just allows them to dabble and forage in the same way as they would in the wild. This has two major benefits, particularly where ducklings are concerned. One, ducklings as they age can be incredibly lazy. So it helps to get them up and about. It's beautifully illustrated, by the way, by the one sat at the back, not doing anything. So yes, lazy duckling. So this use of enrichment gets the birds on their feet, gets the birds moving around, increases the strength in their legs, allows them to stretch their wings, and gets them practicing their foraging behaviours that will be important when they're adults. And the second thing that this does is it basically stops them from annoying their mum. She is really important when they are first hatched. She's their source of warmth, she's their source of waterproofing, and she leads them to various feeding sites. But as they grow and as they get bigger, they can become more of an annoyance to her, particularly if they're constantly hounding her for things to do. So by giving the birds enrichment, we actually give mum, and to some extent dad, a bit of peace and quiet so the ducklings can amuse themselves and she doesn't have to worry about them all of the time. And this enrichment is really helpful to the birds as they grow, because if you think about the chick crumbs and if you think about the layers pellets and the concentrate pellets that we feed them on, that's not necessarily the most interesting diet. So by varying how we feed them and by changing their food presentation, we keep our animals not only more physically active, but also more psychologically active as well. So they get many welfare benefits from this type of enrichment. I hope you've enjoyed this visit to my small bird collection, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing the animals and how they're cared for. I also hope I've been able to explain to you why the tools that we use in captivity for rearing, feeding and managing these species are so integral to wild conservation. And the things that you will learn on your degree at Sparsholt College, Hampshire, will teach you, the future zookeepers, animal managers, curators, and life scientists of this country, all these techniques that are really important to both husbandry, to applied animal science, and to conservation in the zoo, and to conservation in the field. So now it's over to you. I would like to give you a short activity that I hope you'll find interesting and that I hope will prepare you for your studies here at Sparsholt. In this short video, I've given you some examples of how animal behaviour, of how evolution, and of how ecology are really important to the husbandry and management of species in captivity, as well as to the conservation of such species out in the wild. And I've shown you two key examples. One of a species that was very nearly at the brink of extinction, and one of a species that has benefited from human activities and has been able to spread to new areas of the world. And these different fortunes come back to what the animal needs from the wild environment. So I would like you to go away and find 3 examples of birds that have been able to find a new niche which they can now live in thanks to the help of humans. And I would like you to go away and find 3 examples of current successful conservation programs that again involve birds that are based on husbandry practices for other species. So I'm going to give you an example of that last one to help you along. The use of nest boxes and the management of nesting situations, which has been trialled in the wood duck, is now being used on another species of wood-dwelling bird called the Chinese Merganser, or scaly-sided Merganser. This is a very unusual duck, but it's one that also needs our help. The scaly-sided or Chinese Merganser is currently at risk of extinction thanks to a fragmented population and habitat loss. Just the same as we can breed the wood duck very successfully in captivity, so we can breed the Chinese Merganser in captivity as well. And so we can sponsor nest boxes for this bird out in the wild to increase the number of nesting sites available, in exactly the same way the nest boxes in the 20th century helped the wood duck to rebound. So there is an example of a bird that's currently really endangered, in need of conservation help, but whose conservation project is based on a highly successful husbandry model. Can you find me 3 other examples of current bird conservation whose conservation strategy is based on a previous husbandry technique from another species? So what I'm looking for are examples of birds that can spread around the world and have done really successfully thanks to human beings. And what I'm looking for are 3 examples of birds that need our help, and where that help can come from our husbandry knowledge of keeping and rearing more captive species that have done well, because they're a really good tool for management. So from me and my wood ducks, thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for your engagement. We look forward, all of us on your lecturing team, to finally welcoming you in person to University Centre Sparsholt, and to show you some animals in real life at the college's Animal Centre, which is a really important resource we have to support your learning. Hopefully this has given you a flavour for some of the topics that you will experience during your time at University Centre Sparsholt, and it's really whetted your appetite for the things that you'll eventually learn more about.